Here we go. All right, good morning, folks. My name is Courtney. I am the education programmer here for BC and PHA, and I have the privilege of welcoming you before I pass it over to our lovely leader, Jill. I just want to acknowledge that BC and PHA's offices are located on the unceded traditional Coast Salish territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples, but our work takes place throughout the ancestral lands and unceded territories of 198 distinct nations in BC. I will be here as your tech host and producer today. So if you have any questions, if Zoom is being tricky, feel free to just type in the chat, wave your hands frantically, however you can get my attention, I will be paying attention. There will be time to ask questions at the end, and you can save all those, hold them in your hands, or make notes on your desk, or you can type them in the chat as they come up, and I will make a note and make sure that our facilitators and our panelists see them at the end. You can also just like unmute yourself at the end and ask your question yourself, should you wish to do that. Our session is being recorded. It will be emailed out to folks a couple of days after this as well, for you to share or rewatch as you need. And that's all I have. I will pass it over to Jill. Thanks very much, folks.
Thanks so much, Courtney, and welcome everyone. It's great that you've been able to take the time to join us here today to explore the potential impacts of tariffs and retaliatory tariffs on housing development, retrofits, and housing operations. I don't think any of us had this particular conversation on our minds a few months ago, but something tells me that 2025 is going to be full of surprises for us. So as we're used to doing in the housing sector, we're going to roll with it and continue to bring you as up-to-date information as we can, also recognizing that we don't have all of the answers, and that's okay. So I want to just start out by thanking our panelists for committing time into sharing their thoughts and the discussion today. And we really do want this to be a discussion. As you'll hear from the panelists, this is a very active topic of discussion. There's a lot that is unknown. So no question is too big or too small. Feel free to add it to the chat as we go through the conversation, and we'll try to get those elevated and answered for you. We've essentially asked our panelists to read a crystal ball and share their visions with us. Like I said, there isn't any one person right now who can predict precisely how these tariffs are going to unfold, what the impacts are. But we do have two individuals that have been spending their time thinking about it, both from a broader economic lens, exploring the economic impacts, and then impacts within a particular housing organization as well. And so again, this is really meant to be a discussion. In terms of the structure of the session, we're going to hear from each of our panelists and then open it up. So again, plenty of time for questions to hear from all of you. So I'll start very briefly with introductions. We've got two panelists with us. Mark Lee is a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He researches and writes on a variety of economic and social policy issues both in British Columbia and nationally. In addition to tracking federal and provincial budgets and economic trends, Mark has published on a wide range of topics from poverty and inequality to globalization and international trade to public services and regulation, and over the last number of years has had a very specific housing policy lens as well. Stephen Bennett has been the CEO of Affordable Housing Societies since 2017. Prior to joining Affordable Housing Societies, Stephen was the executive director of Evergreen Campus of Care in White Rock, BC, and was responsible for the transformation of the campus, including the construction of a 252-bed state-of-the-art seniors care facility. And under his leadership at AHS, significant affordable housing development within their portfolio in communities throughout the Lower Mainland. Unfortunately, we are missing one panelist. Virginia Holden was scheduled to join us, but unfortunately is ill this week. She's the CEO of Greater Victoria Housing Society, and I know would love to be part of any future conversations on this topic. So to get us started, I'll hand it off to you first, Mark, to just paint a broad picture for us. The tariffs, what's happening with tariffs right now? It seems to change hourly, and then specific impacts on housing, what any of those may be, as well as some broader economic impacts. So I'll hand things off to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jill, and thanks to the BCNPHA for having me be on this panel. Um, we've worked together as organizations for many years now, so it's a privilege to try to reflect some thoughts back to you on this current crazy moment that we find ourselves in. For the last, 4 months or so, I've been really exclusively focused on what's been happening south of the border and trade and how that filters into Canadian public policy and the federal election and all of that. So, as Jill said, it's a very dynamic context. Things are changing often by the minute. And I haven't even looked at where the financial markets are this morning, whether they're up or down. So who knows where it all goes. So I guess I would start by just saying, this moment is being characterized by a massive tariff shock to both the Canadian economy and worldwide, which obviously has impacts on Canada's housing system. Um, but the context for this is that Canada has essentially pursued an agenda of deeper integration with the United States since the mid 1980s. The Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement came in 1989, and that was extended to NAFTA, including Mexico, in 1994. When the first Trump administration came in, there was a similar rattling around tariffs, although not as global and not as large, but there were tariffs that were applied in certain areas like steel and aluminum, and that essentially precipitated a process whereby Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. Renegotiated NAFTA to become the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement, or if you're in the United States, they call it the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement. And now we don't know where we are because essentially the actions that the Trump administration have taken are illegal according to the laws of the Canada of the CUSMA and according to the legal regime under the World Trade Organization. And so similarly, it's not just about Canada and the United States. We are essentially seeing a breakdown right now of the world economic order in terms of trade and the financial system, which has been anchored by the United States since the end of the Second World War. So this is a major shock to everyone's economy, and we're still figuring out exactly how it's going to go. We're still in early days in terms of getting the data back, and it's still kind of a live thing in motion. So the most focus has been on tariffs. So just if you haven't been following the news so much on the trade side, a tariff is a tax that's imposed by the importing country and is largely passed on to consumers in that country. So businesses and households will pay more for the same things because of the tariff applied at the border. President Trump, in the lead up to all of this, had been arguing that those tariffs would be paid by foreign governments or foreign businesses I think that's plausible in some situations. So if you had a company that had a really massive profit margin in its exports to the United States, it might have some scope to lower its prices before hitting the tariff. That would essentially neutralize the impact of the tariffs. But the experience of the last round of Trump tariffs in sort of 2018, 2019 basically showed that almost 100% of the tariffs were passed on to businesses and consumers. So that's the first piece. Those tariffs have come in like four essential flavors in terms of their impacts, and they've been applied in a differential way depending on the country. So when the Trump administration first came back in power in January, or I guess it was early February now, they brought in these national emergency tariffs. So these were, 25% across the board on Mexico and Canada, a lower rate of 10% on energy like oil and gas. And then they sort of backed off them and then were said they're going to do them again and back and forth. And basically, we're in a situation now where that regime is effectively in force as executive orders, but goods covered by the CUSMA agreement, the existing trade agreement we have, are exempt. And so there would be certain situations where like China wouldn't be able to end run U.S. tariffs by exporting to Canada instead and having Canada re-export. Those wouldn't qualify under that specific regime. Secondly, we have sectoral tariffs. So aluminum and steel and automobiles are the key areas right now. Auto parts are still not quite covered yet. It's really finished automobiles. And we do produce some aluminum here in BC, up in Kitimat. We have about 1,500 people, I think, working in that sector. We don't produce steel or cars. In these areas, Canada has retaliated against U.S. Tariffs by imposing tariffs of our own. So the impact of U.S. tariffs is that it has the potential to diminish business activity in Canada and production and exports. The impact of the Canadian counter tariffs is to increase prices in Canada on the specified goods, largely on agricultural goods and raw materials so far. Haven't really hit, I don't think, on the supermarket shelves yet, although it sounds like some of those price increases are imminent as inventories get wound down. Then we also have a third round of tariffs, which are these reciprocal tariffs. So this was a few weeks ago. You might remember the big chart that Donald Trump had out. So essentially, they landed in a place where they're applying a 10% tariff on all imports, but Canada and the US have been exempted from that. And then there was an additional tariff depending on the country based on this weird formula that everyone discovered shortly after didn't actually make any sense and had no rationale. But that second part of the tariffs is currently on hold while the US has individual negotiations with various countries. Essentially, the main country that has borne the brunt of the US tariffs so far is China, now facing 145% tariff into the United States, although there were certain exemptions for various consumer electronics that were made. Similarly, China has retaliated against the United States with 125% tariffs on imports from the United States. China has also retaliated against Canada. Back in August of last year, Canada imposed 100% tariffs on electric vehicles from China, following the United States, which had made a similar determination. And a month ago or so, the Chinese government has imposed retaliatory tariffs on Canadian exports, mostly agricultural and seafood exports to China. And then there's a final category of tariffs that are relevant for us here, which is around softwood lumber. And here there were already additional tariffs applied. These are called anti-dumping and countervailing duty tariffs. There's a whole economic rationale of when and why you can apply those, but largely these have been applied in a political manner by the United States. So we were already facing a 14.5% tariff on our lumber exports to the United States. There's now a process where they're going to be looking at applying additional tariffs in that sector, but we won't find out about that until later in the year. So the big question with all of these things in their totality is, well, how big do the tariffs end up being? How long are they in effect? And then what comes next? Because it's been a roller coaster. Every day it's up and down. Are the tariffs on? Are they off? Who are they applying to and what? And I think there's an element of just, littering the global marketplace with a whole bunch of contradictory stuff. And the impacts of those are still to be determined, both in terms of employment and production and trade. All of those things we're still just starting to get data on that because they're still relatively fresh. So when we shift that into to thinking about what does this mean in terms of the Canadian economy and at a big macroeconomic level. So one, we have a decline in Canada-US trade, right? So the tariffs increase costs on both sides of the borders. Um, there's a decrease in trade between the United States and China, and arguably the United States and the rest of the world. All of that will tend to slow down growth, if not lead us into an outright recession. So, the Bank of Canada has done some modeling for Canada. In their good case scenario, Canada just sort of touches close to zero growth by the second half of this year. And in their bad scenario, it's a hard recession by the end of the year. Um, but Canada is also affected by this overall growth slowdown because we export to other places as well. And in British Columbia, just over half of our exports go to the United States, about 54%. So we have actually diversified our trade a fair bit. We do export to Europe and Asia in addition to the United States. So you have this increase in costs for businesses and consumers, and potentially major disruptions in supply chains. Particularly with goods leaving China going to the United States and vice versa, that I think has potential to be a big piece. And then ultimately, a lot of this comes down to uncertainty. The Bank of Canada just had its latest, interest rate announcement, and they produced what's called the Monetary Policy Report. And if you do a search on the word uncertainty, it appears like 150 times. Like it's literally the word. And the key thing to know about uncertainty is that it undermines business investment. If you're a business, you're not going to be hiring new workers, or less likely to, anyways, or making big new investments to expand production when things are really uncertain. Business tends to follow the state of the economy. When things are rosy, they want to invest and expand capacity. When things are uncertain or more precarious, there will tend to be some retrenchment from that. And I think similarly in terms of consumer confidence. So you sort of have this private sector retrenchment on both the investment side and the consumer side right now. Another major piece of this is around interest rates. So a lot of the attention is on central banks. So the Bank of Canada last week decided not to reduce interest rates, but it had been on a cutting cycle since last July or so. So we have had interest rates come down a fair bit, but the Bank of Canada only controls the shortest of short-term interest rates. So that policy interest rate that gets announced is the overnight rate. It's the rate at which the Bank of Canada lends to the banks themselves. In terms of longer term rates, the further out you get, the more they're determined by the marketplace. And in those longer term rates, they have not come down nearly as much as short term rates are. And in fact, recently they've gone back up a little bit. And that's just because, essentially higher expectations of inflation and uncertainty both tend to increase long-term rates. People who are lending money want a higher rate of return to compensate for those factors. And then kind of interrelated with all of that is the impact that all of this stuff has on the financial markets. So we've seen stock markets go way down and come back up and then go back down again. We had major impacts in the bond market, where the price of bonds was adversely affected. A lot of money is now shifting into gold or Bitcoin, or doesn't really necessarily know a lot of what to do. But these tend to have real balance sheet impacts on different economic actors in the economy. And again, it feeds that whole cycle of uncertainty. And I think, like, overall, worldwide, um, in some senses, you could see that there was a rationale for what Donald Trump was trying to do, right? They wanted to have tariffs, which are a legitimate policy tool, and he wanted to relocate more manufacturing activity back into the United States. But the way that they've gone about it, it was completely ham-fisted to the extent that they could have achieved that at all. And I think what they've done is precipitated a massive crisis of confidence in the United States, that people outside the United States are less likely to want to trade with the United States, less likely to want to invest in the United States, less likely to buy American movies, less likely to travel to the United States, all of which is going to feed deeper recessionary impacts in the United States itself. What's all of this mean for housing? So, first of all, declining investment across the board is this is being affected. I think in housing we are seeing a reduction in sales in the overall resale market. We're seeing a major reduction in pre-sales for condos. Not as bad here yet, but in Toronto, certainly there's been a lot of new private sector projects that have not launched. And I does feel like while there's still a lot of construction activity underway here, it's not clear what replaces it once those projects are done. So it makes me wonder that, in this current situation, the private sector is not particularly good at delivering on the housing that we need. And so maybe there's a stronger role here that can be carved out for nonprofit housing or public housing. Um, we have had already a cooling housing sector over the last year and a half or so. I mean, part of it had to do with higher interest rates starting in 2022, 23, when inflation was running higher. And part of it has to do with demographics, that like this year and next year, there will be negligible population growth compared to the really almost record levels that we saw over the last couple years. So, in terms of the costs of building, I think the good news is that a lot of building materials are sourced already in BC, at least in the big, like things like lumber and concrete. Where I would want to know a little bit more is around some of the other components that go into housing. The flooring, the finishing, the HVAC systems, appliances, a lot of which may be imported and to varying degrees from the United States. And then I also think there's this impact on financing in terms of higher interest rates across the board, all of which kind of make it still very expensive to get housing projects off the ground, particularly at some of the land prices that we've seen, and still dealing with various municipal fees and that kind of thing. So, final thoughts, and I'll turn it over to Stephen. How the other part is on the growth side of the overall economy, just recognizing how much housing was a contributor to our overall economic growth over the past decade. And a lot of the things that supported that being the case are now kind of going in reverse. But also that, just recognizing that most of the Canadian economy, like 80%, is Canada. It's not trade. So trade has an impact for sure. And we have to deal with this shock. But still, a lot of this is Canadian, and there's how we react matters a lot. Can we displace that with domestic sources? Can we displace that with external trade and other plates? And how governments respond also matters a lot. How seriously some of the remarks are in the election campaign about buying Canadian, strengthening internal trade. And I also think how governments, it's important for governments right now to run fairly large deficits because the underlying private sector economy is retrenching. So if we try to overly cut the deficit in the short term, we can actually exacerbate the existing economic situation. So a lot is still to be determined in terms of what happens to us and how we respond to it. So with that, I'll pass it over to Stephen. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Mark. That was a really good contextual overview, including sort of that historical context around globalization, how we've gotten to the trade relationship we have today, and then some of those broader impacts. So to sort of boil it all down, because it's sometimes hard to take a really theoretical conversation and look at impacts for individual organizations. And so Stephen's joined us in order to help us do that. Again, not all of the answers are known, and there is a lot of uncertainty in terms of our response because we're in the midst of an election. But I'll turn it over to Stephen just to talk about how he's thinking through it as the leader of an organization.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, thanks to BCMPHA for putting this on. Thank you, Mark, for your comments. I know I learned an awful lot in the last 20 minutes or so, and really, really appreciate your overview of the situation as we find ourselves in. When Jill reached out to me to ask if I'd be willing to share a little bit on this webinar, she kind of framed it as she said, Stephen, you're the leader of a large housing organization. You guys have probably done a lot of planning already and have a strategy in place for how to mitigate the impact of tariffs. And we at our first planning meeting, I was able to let people know that that's actually not necessarily the case. So part of my role here is to make people feel like it is okay if you're trying to navigate the whiplash as far as how the tariff rollout has gone, and if you're not really sure how to plan or where to go with this. Um, Early in this sort of new tariffs journey, right after Trump got elected, and we heard all sorts of talk about tariffs, our organization actually did start to plan. We tried to figure out what would be impacted and the impact it would have to our organization. We probably spent I don't even know how many hours that we spent trying to dissect this, and no sooner had we thought that we had a bit of a plan than tariffs were canceled. And sort of we thought that was good. And then not long after that, they were back on the table and there were different tariffs. And we broached the topic of trying to plan again. And we felt as an organization that it was a bit of a waste of our time early in the process to be planning until we really understood how this was all going to fall out and maybe let the dust settle on all of the noise before we start getting into a real planning mode. So I just want to say, if you don't feel like you know how to plan, and if you don't have a plan, that's okay. We don't either, and I think that's normal in the environment that we're in. What we did do though is we jumped into more of a risk mitigation mode. So not necessarily planning, but trying to evaluate where the biggest pieces of risk that we had in terms of tariffs, and trying to at least mitigate those risks as much as we can within the environment as we know it. And for us, as an organization, our biggest risk, as we see it, is in our construction projects. So currently we have roughly 570 units of housing in various stages of construction, as well as another 325 units of housing in various stages in the development process. And so we felt like that's probably our most significant risk. And so we've spent a lot of time trying to come up with some risk mitigation strategies. So I'm going to share those, but I'm also really interested to hear from the group as to I'm sure lots of people on this call have their own risk mitigation strategies, and I'm hoping to learn lots from you all as well. So the status as we find it right now, where our construction partners and the construction sector is telling us that they're anticipating that tariffs will add, depending on the type of project, but on average, roughly 4 to 6% of cost increase to projects in the Lower Mainland. As you all know, it's already exceedingly difficult to pull together a pro forma for a project that has any level of affordability built in the current cost climate. So adding 4 to 6% is a bit of a difficult pill to swallow. So what we're doing on projects that are in construction, we've been talking to our trades and our teams, and thankfully, for some of our projects that are far along in the construction process, a lot of the supplies have already been bought and were bought pre-tariffs, or purchase orders were signed pre-tariffs, and so that was, I guess, the first bit of good news for us is for projects that are completing in 2025. We don't actually anticipate any impact from tariffs for those projects, and if there is, it will be very minor. Um, for projects that are completing in 2026, there is obviously some risk. And so what we've asked our contractors and trades to do is to identify where those risks are based on what we know today. And we've given them some flexibilities. We know it changes from week to week and month to month, but based on what we know today, we've asked them to quantify what that risk is and then ask them to come up with risk mitigation strategies. Are there products available from elsewhere? Would it make sense to look elsewhere? Uh, Similarly, with projects that are in development, um, our process, and we're a bit more rigid on this process. We just went through a tender process where once we had the low bidders from each trade, uh, we sat down, our development partners sat down with each of the trades and asked them to go through their bid book and highlight tariff risk line items in their bid, and then to go back and rebid with products that were not that did not have the same tariff risk. So Canadian products or products from elsewhere that wouldn't be impacted the same way as US products would be impacted. So that was a good process. The unfortunate thing in that process, and this is something that's sort of late breaking news for us in the last few days, is we're seeing that what we think is the biggest risk in the construction process for us is HVAC equipment. And unfortunately, much of the HVAC equipment is manufactured in the States. We don't do a lot of it here in Canada. And the manufacturers here in Canada are now being inundated with requests from trades, and to the point that those manufacturers have had to raise their prices to a point where there's actually no cost savings with going with a Canadian manufacturer. In some cases, it's more expensive because they don't have the capacity to produce as much as the construction sector needs. And so that's I don't know how to mitigate that, but just in terms of big picture, we're trying to take a strategic approach to mitigate risk when it comes to construction projects, and time will tell a little bit as to how effective it is. I think, Jill, it might make sense to have another one of these forums maybe 3 or 4 months from now, when some of the strategies might have played out a little bit more. Operationally, we're a little bit behind the 8 ball as an organization operationally with our risk mitigation strategies. And actually, I'm disappointed that Ginny from Greater Victoria Housing Society isn't here today, because I know their organization has done a lot of work on this, and I was hoping to learn from a lot from her. But perhaps other people on the call have done some work, and will be able to speak up and share some of their stories as well. So that's it for me.
Great. Thanks so much, Stephen. As people who know me know, I've got lots of questions, but I want to open it up first to the group before digging into my questions to see if there are any that are emerging or bubbling to the surface for you immediately. So you can either unmute yourself and ask that question or pop it into the chat. So I'll just give you a moment there. And it's fine if you're just still processing all of that information as well. So it looks like we might have a whole lot of people online who are still in processing mode. One of the things that came up last week when the panelists grouped together to discuss the webinar was governance. So in your organization, Stephen, how are you keeping your board up to date? Most boards meet quarterly or 5-6 times a year. And I can imagine they've got lots of questions about risk mitigation strategies. And so how are you keeping them up to date on the changing circumstances with new development?
Yeah, so one of the, sometimes it's a gift, sometimes it's a curse, but let's call it a gift in this context. One of the gifts with my board is we meet every month. And so it is an ongoing conversation. I think one of the biggest things the uncertainty is doing, we have a very aggressive strategic plan in terms of building new units. Our target is to have 5,000 units by 2030. And so that's when we set that goal 4 years ago. At the time, we were at 3,500 units. So it's a very aggressive strategy. So a lot of our eggs are in the construction basket. And so there is a lot of concern from our board around exposing us to too much risk in that area. So it's an ongoing conversation. I don't have the answers for them, and I'm pretty honest about that with our board. I don't pretend to know what I don't know, and we'll see how that plays out over the coming months. But I think that the bottom line is they are concerned. The last 3 months, I bet we've talked 30, 35 minutes at each board meeting about tariffs specifically and risk mitigation and sort of future planning. So again, don't have the answers, but it's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, and I'm sure most boards would be suspicious if you did think you had all the answers as well, because nobody else seems to. There is a question here from the group, and I'm not sure that we can answer it, but will BC Housing pick up the bill for tariffs if projects are midway through construction? We chatted a little bit about that briefly, and one of my takeaways from this webinar is to see if we can engage BC Housing in that conversation just to get a bit of certainty. And I imagine what they're experiencing right now is trying to provide certainty in a pretty uncertain time. So we'll see if we can get more information out to the sector on that. But I don't think we've got an immediate answer there. And we'll have a similar conversation with CMHC. I know this is a very live conversation for the federal government, obviously, and very early on organized a roundtable that we participated in to get some early thinking on the potential impacts of tariffs. So I know that it's very much on CMHC's radar. But cost certainty, I don't think there's been any indication from either BC Housing or CMHC about how they're planning to deal with that, but we will follow up on it. Just in terms of other, and this is maybe a question for both of you, in terms of sort of filtering the noise, I just know for me personally, in the early days, and I think you both alluded to this, this was on all of our minds. We were following hour by hour what was going to happen. And then there was just so much noise, it really became difficult to focus. There's a lot of media coverage on it. How do you determine sort of what's truly relevant to the sector, your immediate line of work, which is building housing, and how do you filter out the noise? Are there any sources you pay attention to in particular to kind of help provide you some solid guidance? And it's probably not on X anymore.
Yeah, I'll jump in first. I'm curious what Mark says here, but I actually I think, are there any sources? I'd say I'm using less sources than I was a few months ago. I almost liken it, maybe not quite as extreme, but in the early days of the pandemic, I was every hour I was checking what's the latest sort of COVID count and all of that. You know when Trump started making the announcements, I was on CNN like every 15 minutes, like hitting the refresh button to see what was next. And I think that becomes unhealthy from a mental health perspective. And so I've dialed it back a lot, recognizing that there's very little that myself or our organizations can control. And so trying to stay in touch with what's happening from a very big picture perspective, but ignoring the noise that's ongoing and constant.
Yeah, that's healthy advice, Stephen. Mark, did you have anything to chime in on there?
Yeah, well, we've been obsessed with the, the trade stuff the entire time. Yeah, if folks are interested in more, if you go to policyalternatives.ca, we have like tons of commentary on the impact of the tariffs and some of the stuff around interprovincial trade barriers, which in my opinion is mostly bunk, and some of the stuff related to the federal election. So I just encourage you to take a look there. I do think this idea that in the question of I don't know if it's BC Housing, but maybe it's CMHC because tariffs are collected federally. And Mark Carney at least has made a commitment to flow any tariff revenue the federal government gets back to affected workers and communities and sectors. I feel like there's a real space for some lobbying around this. That getting CMHC or maybe through a transfer to BC Housing or some kind of arrangement that those tariffs could be covered, and that would be a real help to the industry. It seems to me. So I would encourage you guys to push forward in that space.
Yeah, that's great. And it was reassuring. That was something we were pushing for in that early roundtable we participated in. And it was encouraging to hear. And again, we're in the midst of a federal election, so we don't know exactly what the future holds. But it was reassuring to hear that that the revenue from those counter tariffs could be redirected in that way. Uh, where I guess another question as well. I feel like we've been living in this environment for a few years, and just with uncertainty. So first we went through the pandemic, and then some of the impacts of the pandemic related to inflation, interest rate increases, labor shortages. So I think it's safe to say now that in some ways it's just sort of business as usual to be living in very, very uncertain times. And I think as leaders, needing to balance urgency with caution and planning. And I know, Stephen, for you, we've talked a little bit about how you're keeping your board up to date, but then you've also got a large staff team that's facing uncertainty. So how do you strike that balance with incomplete information and with living through uncertainty?
I actually think the fact that we've all lived through uncertainty for the last, let's call it the last 5 years, is sort of the test case that we can do it. That's been really uncertain times in housing. But Jill, you probably have these numbers better than I. I bet we've done more for housing in this province as a sector in the last 5 to 8 years than has been done in any similar time period in history, in spite of the uncertainty. And so organizations like all the ones represented in this webinar today are doing incredible work within the uncertainty. And I think that's it. Like it's uncertain, yes, but we've been working uncertainly for many, many years now and doing really, really excellent work. And so I when every time I have a chance, I remind our staff of the, exceptional work they do in really, really challenging times and circumstances. And we're not going to stop performing really, really well, in spite of what's going on around us.
I wonder too if just sort of thinking about some of the impacts. So, you've received more recent information on potential cost increases in your projects. You've got a very ambitious goals within your strategic plan related to new development. what are you looking for? And it kind of gets back to where Mark was going, just around an advocacy strategy. What sort of assurance would you be looking for from government to help ensure that you stay on that very aggressive building strategy? Because we're going to need all nonprofits to keep focused on building new as well as maintaining existing. Is there anything specific you'd be looking for from government?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, from an operational perspective, I think many on this call will have received sort of BC Housing's target 3% budget increase letter uh, at the start of the year, at the end of last year. I can't remember when it came out, but if that I'm looking for some certainty around what BC Housing will do with operational budgets, in light of the fact that there's cost pressures that none of us could have predicted and certainly are completely out with our control. So I'd like some certainty there from an operational perspective. From a construction and growth perspective, as Mark mentioned, we have heard Mark Carney say that funds recovered from tariffs will be put back into um, housing and the various sectors that are impacted. I'm looking for whatever the new programs are after the election, but let's pretend they're the same. I'm looking for some of that money to be put back into the CMHC grant mechanisms to increase the dollars per door that are available for grants, so that we can mitigate that 4 to 6% of cost increase. So things like that, maybe for it to be reflected in BC Housing's hopefully upcoming community housing fund proposal call in the spring, if it happens, to be reflected there in terms of the grants available as well, because we yeah none of us want to see rents go up. We want our rents to be affordable for the people who need them most, and so we don't have other mechanisms to do that other than either decreasing cost, which isn't going to happen, or increasing grants and equity into projects.
Yeah,
Are you
thanks.
seeing any easing in construction, like labor costs, which have gone up so much in recent years? I'm just curious what it looks like on the ground right now.
I'm wondering if anyone else on the call has any comments on that. My comment is we haven't seen personally, we haven't seen easing. We've seen plateauing, um, but we haven't seen costs decrease.
There's a
And
question. Oh, sorry, go ahead,
I was
Stephen.
just gonna say, I mean, there are things, the recent code changes caused so that the code changes caused costs to go up. I mean, maybe if code changes hadn't happened, we might have seen costs come down, but there's various factors there.
Sam's got a question in the chat here. Is there a crystal ball sense of how soon after the federal election we might get a little bit more clarity on where and what level the tariffs might be sticking for the longer term? Mark, maybe I'll put that one over to you just in terms of elections on Monday. There's going to be cabinet swearing in, like these things all take time before we get into the nuts and bolts of any sort of policy response. Do you want to speak to that one?
Well, I mean, Mark Carney has stated, based on his first conversation with Donald Trump, that they will be entering into negotiations right after the federal election. Now, how long those negotiations take, what form they take, where we end up, I think is very uncertain, as is kind of the end game for the government. In spite of a lot of the rhetoric that we've heard during the election campaign about making Canada strong and supporting internal trade and diversification and that kind of stuff, I think the core business constituency in Canada, like the big businesses, particularly a lot of American owned businesses in the resource sector, I think they want to just get back to status quo as quickly as possible, maybe with some concessions on the part of Canada. So that may be the game. Personally, I would love to see much more of the build Canada stuff actually happen. So there's that part of it and what that ends up looking like. And then there's what happens in the housing sector, depending on which way the election goes. But assuming, as the polls suggest, that the Liberals will win, they've put some stuff on the table there in terms of a more activist role for the federal government in all of this. Um, if he's serious about much more dedicated public sector building of housing, that could be a good thing. But how does that mesh with the nonprofit sector across Canada? We don't know. And all of these things are going to take time. It'll take a bit of time to roll out on all of that stuff. And in the interim, there's this sort of the impact of what's happened over the last few months has a bunch of inertia that's going to carry forward for the foreseeable future. So, if anything, right now the focus should be on fiscal policy and making sure that the economy of Canada doesn't slide into recession. And generally, that means if we can keep interest rates going down, that would be great. And federal deficits and supporting workers in affected communities and affected sectors will be really, really important.
Yeah, so needless to say, it's going to take some time, and as I was saying before we started the webinar, when we look at the platforms of each of the parties, regardless of who forms government, I think we will see a focus on housing, and regardless of who forms government, it's going to certainly look different than it does now. And so there's a lot of uncertainty, and particularly for the nonprofit sector. I don't think in either of the two main platforms we have a really clearly dedicated and articulated role within that. So that's going to require the sector to continue advocating for ourselves, regardless of who forms government. But it will take time, I think, for all of this to be known. I just want to open it up before we close out the webinar to see if there are any last minute thoughts. As Courtney posted in the chat there, it doesn't need to be in the form of a question. If you want to share what your own experiences have been through as you wade through this issue that you feel might be helpful for others to know, please feel free to share that as well. Oh, Lori, I see you've got your hand up.
Thanks. I wonder if anyone can speak to, and I won't hold anyone to this, but we've recently renewed our insurance. And so the replacement value came up. We only have 2 facilities presently, but we do have one in the next couple of years. And I wondered if anyone could speak to sort of this replacement value or what kind of percentage we should be considering. Can anyone speak to that?
I'm gonna jump in because I literally just got our insurance letter yesterday. And so yesterday they said that for without an appraisal, they want an automatic 4.5% increase in value to all of our locations. So
And
we all know what that does to premiums.
yeah. And what's your approach there, Stephen? Because then it's without that, you're looking at an appraisal for each of the properties.
Yeah, I don't know yet. I literally just got the letter, and my suspicion is that, like, I actually think 4.5% seems reasonable in the current climate. But yeah, we need to dissect that a little bit.
Okay, that's helpful. Lori, we, as you probably know, have been doing quite a bit of work around insurance. So I can follow up with you after the call as well to see if we can be helpful with more information. And I've seen Madeline's got a question here, a quote. Oh, that's on insurance as well. $20,000 increase in premiums. Yeah, we have redesigned our program in order to stabilize the runaway premium increases that we've seen over the last number of years. We've got a very well-performing portfolio within the sector across the province, which often surprises people, but very, very low loss ratios in our sector. And so we've been doing some work to better aggregate the sector in order to stabilize those premiums. So we can share more information on that, and I'll follow up with each of you afterwards. But I do think we've kind of come to the end of our time together. I really like the suggestion, I think it was yours, Stephen, to keep this conversation going, to host a conversation like this every few months, because this is a quickly and slowly evolving conversation. And I think much more will be known, and we'll likely have more unknowns in 3 to 4 months' time. So we'll continue the conversation and host this regularly. And then, of course, in person back at Housing Central in November. So I'd like to thank Stephen and Mark for sharing your thinking, your expertise, and the fact that we're kind of in this together, and there is a lot that's unknown. So just even a recognition of that is very, very helpful, because I think for each housing provider, we can sometimes, or you can sometimes feel a bit isolated in your work. Every single one of you is going through this together. So thanks for sharing your expertise and knowledge, and we'll reconvene again on this topic at some point soon. Thanks for joining, everyone.